I worked as a custodian at a high school for 3 years. I was the newest guy on the team, so most of the time I got stuck with the overnight shifts. The building was huge, 4 floors and 2 gyms, and at night when it was empty, it felt like a giant maze. The rule was to go floor by floor, room by room, turning off lights, emptying trash, and locking doors. It usually took the whole night to cover everything, and if you tried to rush, you'd miss something. One Friday night, I was working alone because one of the other custodians had called out sick. Normally, we worked in pairs, so I wasn't used to being the only one on duty. At first, the shift was normal. I started on the first floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the hallways. The lights in some of the old corridors flickered, which made the shadows jump around, but I told myself it was just the building settling. Around midnight, I made my way up to the third floor. That floor always gave me a bad feeling because it was quieter than the others. It had a lot of older classrooms that weren't used anymore. Some permanently locked, and others were just storage rooms filled with dusty books, broken furniture, and old lab equipment. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the lockers. The metallic click of the doors and the echo of my boots against the tiles made me jump a few times. I kept reminding myself it was normal. I was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when I noticed the door about 20 feet away was open. That struck me immediately because I had already checked all the rooms earlier in the evening, and every door had been locked. My first instinct was to walk past it quickly and ignore it, but something made me stop. I set my mop against the wall and walked over slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window. I pushed it open slowly, shining my flashlight inside. The room looked empty. The desks were stacked along the walls, and boxes were in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. But then I noticed that one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was tilted, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor like it had been dragged across the tiles. My stomach sank. I knew that I had closed that door earlier, and I knew that I hadn't moved that box. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me because I was tired. I pulled the door closed and went back to mopping, but my mind kept wandering to that room. I kept thinking I should check the windows. Maybe a student had snuck in somehow, but all the windows were locked from the inside, and the hallway doors were locked as well. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched and focused on the cleaning. After finishing that hallway, I went down to the stairwell to head to the second floor. As I walked past that same classroom again, my heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had shut it before. I slowly stepped closer. I peeked inside, and the room looked normal, except the box was now moved to the center of the floor. My pulse was racing. I whispered, "Hello, who's in here?" My voice sounded tiny in the emptiness of the building. I waited, but there was silence. And then from the back of the room, I heard slow, deep breathing. Not a gust of wind or a pipe. It was someone trying to be quiet, but making sure I could hear it. I tried to convince myself it was a student hiding, playing a prank. But how would they have gotten in? I was the only one who was supposed to be there, and all the doors were locked. I slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. My heart was hammering and sweat ran down my back. I stayed pressed against the stairwell door, listening. I debated calling my supervisor, even though I hated bothering him in the middle of the night. Finally, I did. When he picked up, I told him what was happening, trying to keep my voice steady. He said he would be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. I stayed as far away from that room as possible, peeking over my shoulder every few seconds. Finally, he arrived. We went back up together. He had a big flashlight and walked straight into the classroom. The box was still in the middle of the floor. We checked everywhere. The closets, under the tables, behind the desks. There was nothing. He suggested I was just tired or imagining things. I didn't argue, but I knew what I had heard. That slow, heavy breathing. I tried to finish the rest of my shift with him there, but I kept glancing at that classroom. The hallway felt colder and more oppressive than ever. Even sweeping and mopping didn't distract me. Every time I passed the lockers, I expected it to swing open. Every shadow seemed like a person standing just out of view. Weeks later, when I worked with another custodian, he told me that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that classroom overnight. They had snuck in to play a prank, but it scared the staff so much that they never used that room again. It made sense, but it didn't explain the breathing I heard that night. There was no one else in the school. I finished the shift and left, but every time I thought about it, my stomach twisted. I started taking extra precautions. I made sure that all the doors were locked as I passed. I kept my flashlight pointed at the floor and stayed near the stairwell if I had to pass that hallway. Months later, I had another overnight shift alone. I avoided that third floor for as long as possible. When I finally had to go up, I moved as quickly as I could. I kept thinking I'd hear it again. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Even when I was in a room far from that classroom, I felt like eyes were on me. Every creak of the floor made me jump. I finished the shift and left quickly, never looking back. I refused to work that floor alone again. Even years later, I avoided it whenever I could. I never found out if it would have been a student hiding or something else, but I'll never forget the sound of that breathing coming from a classroom that should have been empty. I can still hear it in my head sometimes. I used to work as a custodian at a middle school for almost 5 years, and I was usually on the overnight shift. I would clock in around 10 at night and stay until right before the sun came up when the buses started pulling in. At first, I actually liked the job. I didn't have to deal with the kids running down the hallways, teachers complaining about stuff, or anyone really. The quiet didn't bother me, and I liked being left alone to do my work. But as time went on, I started to notice how different the school felt at night compared to during the day. It wasn't just quiet, it felt dead. The building creaked and groaned like it was breathing. And when you're the only person in there, even the smallest sound will set you on edge. You'd hear a locker pop open on its own, or the pipes knocking in the walls, and your brain would make you think it was footsteps. I learned to ignore a lot of that, but one part of the school I never really got used to was the basement. The school was old, built in the 1950s, and the basement ran underneath half of it. It wasn't finished nicely like the classrooms. It was a concrete maze of storage rooms and long, narrow halls with pipes and wires hanging overhead. Some of the rooms were full of old desks, some had boxes of outdated textbooks, others had broken furniture stacked up. It always smelled damp and musty down there. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered when they even worked at all. A lot of the time, you had to bring a flashlight just to see where you were going. When I first started, one of the older custodians told me to avoid the basement unless I absolutely had to go down there. He said it wasn't worth the trouble and joked that it was haunted. I laughed along, but even in that first week, I noticed how uneasy I felt in that part of the building. It was like stepping into a different world compared to the bright hallways upstairs. There were nights when I would pass the door to the basement and feel a chill just from looking at it. But usually I didn't have to go down there, so I avoided it whenever possible. One night, about 2 years into the job, I had a list of tasks taped to my cart, and one of them was to bring up a set of folding chairs for an event. I groaned as soon as I saw it because the only place those chairs were kept was the basement. I remember standing at the top of the basement stairwell door for a good minute just debating if I could ask my supervisor if it could wait till morning, but I didn't want to look lazy. So I grabbed my flashlight and opened the heavy door. The stairwell echoed with every step I took, like my boots were way too loud. I got to the bottom and flipped the switch, but only a couple of the overhead lights came on. They left most of the hallway in darkness. I swear, it smelled like wet cement down there. I turned on my flashlight and started walking. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The first room was full of old desks piled all the way to the ceiling. The second door was half rusted, and it squealed like nails on chalkboard when I pulled it open. Inside, the room smelled like dust and wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall in uneven piles. I bent down and started pulling them out, trying to carry as many as I could at once so I wouldn't have to make so many trips. I had just picked up 4 when I froze. From somewhere out in the hallway, I heard a soft dragging sound, like someone was slowly sliding their shoe across the floor. I held my breath, still bent over with the chairs in my arms, listening as hard as I could. The sound stopped. I straightened up and peeked my head out into the hallway, shining the flashlight both ways. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. My heart was thumping in my ears. I stood there for what felt like forever before finally telling myself it was probably just the pipes, or maybe I had shifted a chair without realizing it. I carried the first load out into the hallway and toward the stairs. As I walked, I suddenly felt a cold draft against my face. It was so out of place that it made me stop mid-step. The building was always warm and stale with no windows and no moving air. This felt like standing next to an open freezer. I shined my light up and down the hallway, but nothing looked different. I shook it off, set the chairs at the bottom of the stairs, and went back for more. When I walked into the storage room again, something felt off. The stack of chairs looked different somehow, like they had shifted while I was gone. I frowned at them, trying to remember exactly how they'd been leaning. I finally told myself I was just being paranoid and picked up another load. This time, as I turned to leave, I heard it again, a thump followed by a scraping sound. It came from further down the basement hallway. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I aimed it that way. About 20 feet down, one of the classroom doors that should have been closed tight was cracked open. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't touched that door. The school was locked up every night and no one was supposed to be there except me. I stood frozen in the doorway of the storage room, staring at that cracked door. Every part of me screamed to drop the chairs and run upstairs, but I just stood there. I told myself maybe the door had come loose, or maybe when I opened another door, the air pressure had shifted. I clung to those excuses like a lifeline. I carried the chairs quickly to the stairwell, then came back with my flashlight in one hand, empty-handed this time. The cracked door was still there, open just enough for someone to peek out. My throat got dry. I creeped toward it slowly, each step echoing. When I was close, I called out, "Hello? Anyone down here?" My voice cracked, and it sounded small in the big empty basement. No answer. I swallowed hard, then pushed the door open fast with my free hand and shined the flashlight inside. The room was empty, just shelves of dusty science equipment, boxes stacked high, cobwebs in the corners. I stepped inside for a second, heart racing, listening for any sound. That's when I heard it again, a dragging shuffle, but this time it was behind me in the hallway. I spun around and pointed the flashlight with the beam cutting down the corridor. Nothing, just shadows and concrete. But I felt it, that heavy pressure you get when you know you're being watched. My skin prickled all over. I didn't care about the chairs anymore. I backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed down the hallway, and made my way toward the stairwell. When I got to the stairs, I grabbed the chairs I'd left and carried them up 2 steps at a time. I didn't stop until I was back in the main hallway upstairs, gasping for breath. I leaned against the wall, sweating, even though the school was cold. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe it had been rats or water pipes, but I couldn't explain the cracked door. I locked the stairwell door behind me, even though I wasn't supposed to, and I didn't go back down for the rest of the night. A week later, I was mopping the hallway just above the basement stairs when I heard it again. 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like someone hitting the wall with their hand. The mop slipped out of my hand, water dripping onto the tiles. I froze and listened. Then I heard the basement door rattle like someone had shoved it from the other side. My blood went cold. I didn't open it. I stood there gripping the mop handle until the sound stopped. After that, I refused to go down into the basement alone. If anything needed to come up, I'd wait until another custodian was there. I never told the others what I heard because I knew they'd either laugh or tell me it was the so-called ghost. But I know what I felt and I know what I heard. To this day, when I think about those slow dragging footsteps behind me, I feel sick to my stomach.
I worked as a night custodian at an old high school for 2 years. The worst part of the job was always the auditorium. It was massive, with 3 levels of seating, a big stage and long, heavy curtains that hung from the ceiling. During the day, it looked normal, but at night, when the building was empty, it felt like stepping into a completely different place. Even with the lights on, there were shadows in every corner that seemed darker than they should be. Sound carried strangely in there. If you dropped a broom, the echo would stretch and bounce, making it hard to tell exactly where the sound came from. Most nights, I saved the auditorium for last because I hated going in there. There was just something about it that always made my skin crawl. Near the end of winter one year, I had to clean it earlier than usual because there was going to be a play the next morning. I arrived around midnight, dragging my cart behind me. The side door creaked loudly as I opened it, and when it slammed shut behind me, the echo traveled across the empty room. I started by sweeping the aisles between the seats. The chairs were old metal folding seats bolted to the floor in some rows, and in other rows they were loose. As I pushed the broom, I listened to the scraping sound echo off the walls and ceiling. After a few minutes, I thought I heard something else. It was faint at first, like a soft rustling from the stage. I froze, thinking maybe a prop had fallen over. But when I looked, the stage was empty. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing. I continued sweeping. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time, it was more distinct, the sound of slow footsteps across the stage. I stopped sweeping and looked toward the stage. I could see the stacked props in the corners. Nothing moved, but the sound was real. My breathing became shallow. I slowly climbed the steps onto the stage, shining the flashlight behind the curtains. There were ropes, pulleys, old chairs, and painted scenery stacked against the walls. Everything was covered in dust, and the beam of my light made it dance like it was moving. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was nearby. I backed off the stage, telling myself it was just the building settling, maybe a mouse in the rafters. But the feeling didn't go away. I continued sweeping down the aisles, trying to finish as fast as possible. My mind kept going back to the stage. The sound of those slow footsteps repeated in my head, even though I couldn't hear them anymore. I finished sweeping the lower level and started mopping. As I pushed the mop through the rows, I thought I saw a shadow move across the second tier of seats. I moved my flashlight toward the seats, but nothing was there. I tried to tell myself it was a trick of the light. I kept my back to the wall as I moved, feeling as if someone were behind me.
I had nearly finished mopping the main floor when I heard it again. A whisper. I couldn't make out words, but it was low, and it was coming from the balcony seats above me. My heart was now hammering, my flashlight's beam trembling in my hands. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I had to finish the job. I told myself it was someone outside or maybe a janitor who had forgotten something, but I knew I was alone. I kept mopping slowly, my ears straining. The whispering continued, almost like it was moving closer. I tried calling out, but I was so nervous that my voice sounded weak. There was no answer, only the echo of my voice. I finished mopping the main floor and started cleaning the stage itself. The steps up felt endless, and every time I moved my flashlight, I thought I saw something just at the edge of the beam. Sometimes it was a flicker of a shadow. Sometimes it was just my imagination. When I reached the stage, I looked over the edge of the main floor. The seats stretched back in the darkness. I shined the flashlight into the balcony, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure sitting there, just a silhouette. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was a chair or a coat, but the feeling didn't leave me. I started dusting and moving props, trying to focus on something physical. The whispering came again, much clearer this time. It sounded like someone speaking my name almost directly behind me. I spun around so fast that the flashlight slipped in my hands. The stage was empty. Nothing. The props were still stacked in the same place, and the curtains didn't move.
but I knew I hadn't imagined the voice. I backed away slowly, with my heart racing, and I moved toward the side door. I stopped at the edge of the stage and listened. I could hear soft footsteps on the upper levels moving slowly across the balcony. I told myself it was impossible. The auditorium was locked. No one else should have been there. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting as if someone were pacing and watching me. I finally ran to the door, grabbed the handle, and pulled it open. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and I felt relief, but I could still hear the faint echo of footsteps above, fading away slowly. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the door behind me. I leaned against it, catching my breath, feeling the sweat running down my forehead. I didn't go back inside that night. The next morning, I tried to tell another custodian about what happened, and he laughed at me, saying it's an old building and probably just settles or something. But I'm not convinced. That whispering voice and my name being called so softly and deliberately, and the footsteps pacing above me. I felt them in the air around me. Weeks later, I learned that years ago, a drama teacher had died suddenly in that auditorium during rehearsal. Heart attack, right on stage in front of students. People said sometimes you could still hear him walking the stage at night or hear whispers in the seats. I tried to convince myself it's just a story, that the sounds were normal for an old building. But the way that voice whispered my name and the footsteps echoed, I can never forget it. Maybe I was going crazy. I don't know. After that night, I refused to clean the auditorium. I quit that job not long after. But sometimes, even when other people were in the building, I would feel the same cold pressure in the auditorium and feel that same way about being watched. I know what I experienced was real, at least real to me. I've never had any kind of schizophrenic episodes or anything like that, so this whole thing still just baffles me to this day.